Right, time for our paper review this morning. Joining us, I'm delighted to say, is Dr. Roger Gewolb, who is a political commentator and a personal finance expert. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Really good to see you. Really good to see you. Right, shall we start with Daniel Khalif? Your thoughts, really. I mean, it's on everywhere this morning. The Sun, I love this one. Got him. Short and pithy. And then also, I quite like this one as well. Spooks, bugs, phones to nail the jailbreak spy. So these are big headlines. I think the police have actually done a remarkable job. Also, just in terms of that manhunt, it seems that all the stops were pulled out. I think the public did a great job. They had all of these incredible messages from the public as well, just saying, we think we've seen this suspect. And of course, he was found in Chiswick.
Yeah, that he hung around Chiswick rather than fled the country is maybe he was looking.
Very nice.
Maybe he was looking for a job as a chef in a restaurant there. I don't know. You know, there's a lot of nice eateries in Chiswick.
There are. What do you think about the response from the police?
Yeah, great. I think what you said is very apposite. And as Jackie, the lady, said, well, you know, I mean, Jackie, you can't win the way you put it. I mean, you know, they're out there and they catch somebody, and then you say, well, that's what they should be doing all the time. No, I think they did.
Well, she's right.
Well, yeah, but there's a resource issue, of course, but I think we need to support them a bit more, and I think what they did here was very good. He's an interesting character. I mean, I'd like to learn a bit more about him. Apparently, he sat next to a lady. Well, first of all, he kept bragging to his prison mates that he kept saying, "Just watch me." He was going to escape. He's been saying this for ages. Just watch me. And then apparently he sat next to this lady on a bench in the park. And she said he was absolutely lovely and charming, petted my dog. He was a very sweet man who said he was an ex-soldier. So he's obviously a very complex character.
I'm amazing he didn't just pitch up at the Iranian embassy, because that's actually probably one of the most sensible things.
Which is what many people thought he would do, actually. Clearly, they would have been on the lookout for that as well. I mean, you're right, he's a very complex individual, but also he's got form. And then there's the big question, why on earth was he in a Category B prison when he obviously was a risk, a flight risk? He was known to be a flight risk. He should have been in a Category A, shouldn't he?
Well, as one newspaper said, why, when he went around bragging to his prison mates, just watch me, didn't somebody report that and do something about it? But what you say about the Iranian embassy is true. I mean, how many spy movies have we all seen where there's a furtive telephone call in a phone booth saying, stay where you are, we'll come and get you? I mean, why didn't they pick him up and skirt him off to Tehran or whatever?
Phone booth.
I mean, to be fair, with the level of manhunt that was going on all across West London, as we saw police helicopters, we had all of these police on the streets. Also, as I said, I think the public have acted brilliantly here, and informing the police and giving them the data. I go back to the point. I think the police have done a great job.
Great job, absolutely. And I'd like to learn more about the backstory about this guy and what he was actually doing
when the movie comes out.
When the movie comes out,
right, let's move on to the Sun. What have you got for us in the Sun?
In the Sun, we have the Sun. We have 33.2 degrees centigrade, which is 92 degrees Fahrenheit.
For people across the pond.
Yeah, for people across the pond. Well, actually, I mean, this is what I grew up with. I'm from Chicago, and this is what every day was like, and so I'm quite used to it.
And you're still here?
And in a suit.
I'm still here, and in a suit as well, absolutely. So there are mixed reports that I've read that this afternoon there's going to be thunder showers, which are going to put an end to all of this. And then I saw on the internet a report that the Saharan something or other, it means this is going to carry on next week.
Good.
So you have vested interest in
it. I do. I'm having a garden party today, Roger, so don't encourage
garden party, blessing, absolutely.
I'll bring an umbrella.
I hope this goes on next week. We should savor every moment of this.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's great. I said, actually, when you look at people are happy. It's great. You know, people's moods have lifted, although it is actually very dark in the morning. And you can see autumn approaching. Well, we're in autumn, aren't we? But you can see winter approaching.
5 years ago, when I was 8 months pregnant, it was 38 degrees. And instead of going for my run, which I was still doing then, I went swimming instead. It was that hot. So for me to switch, it was hot.
Well, I mean, I sat on my balcony yesterday and I like the sun, but it was way too hot for even me. I mean, it was extraordinarily. And, you know, we also have to remember older people, don't we? And making sure that people are hydrated.
Sure.
And all of that stuff's really important. Do you want to say something about older people,
Yes, of
vulnerable
course.
people?
And I think all I would say on this is, you know, make your own risk assessment, be sensible, don't go out and do silly things, don't get sunburn, it's really bad for you, and I know that because I used to do it. You know, stay hydrated, as David says, and sit in the shade if you can. But make your own risk assessment. We're all grown-ups and we should be able to assess what's good and bad for us.
Yes.
What you say about happy, I think is important. It makes such a difference here.
Doesn't it?
I've been here for decades, and I always say, if the weather was like this all the time, this island would sink into the sea. There'd be so many people wanting to stand on it.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, I mean, look, it's a fantastic country when we have the weather. It's just so
It's a fantastic country without the weather.
It is.
But with the weather, it would be almost too much to
It's
bear.
actually the unpredictability of it. That's what
I think that's what people can't deal with.
Yeah.
And throughout the summer, it's been absolutely miserable. And of course, now we're like, ooh, one day, let's summer.
But you can never plan anything that you want
No,
outside
you
because
can't.
you never know.
But isn't it true that every September and October this happens? We get good weather and say
It's
how
starting
unusual.
to change, definitely. And I was asking, is this an Indian summer? Apparently it isn't, because of lots of meteorological reasons. But there we go.
Oh, really?
But yes, so certainly. Right, let's move on. This is a really good story about Jaguar Land Rover, isn't it?
They have pulled, pardon me, they have pulled their support for Prince Harry and for the Invictus Games. This is a great story. Because they have joined all those people that feel that Harry and Meghan's brand has become toxic.
Oh, that's a shame, I think. And I think that's a bit churlish, to be honest with you. I think the Invictus Games are an amazing
So do
thing.
I.
You know, there are ex-soldiers and, you know, whatever.
Oh, no, absolutely.
Who actually are spurred on to actually overcome the most terrible tragedy by those games.
But you see, this goes back to that documentary they've made, and we talked about it on Drive, because Harry's there talking about his traumas, which I understand as a former service personnel as well. I completely get that. I want to see more about the athletes and their stories, and I want to see less about Harry and Meghan.
Well, I think, if I may, I think that pulling their support from Harry and Meghan because their brand is toxic is not unusual. I think that pulling their support by reference from the Invictus Games is nasty and unwarranted.
I agree.
But the worst part of this story is, who do you think replaced Jaguar Land Rover?
I know.
Because I told him.
You told me.
Boeing. Boeing carbon footprint.
So how does that play with Harry and Meghan and their green credentials?
Well, I don't know. Ask them when you see them on their next private jet.
Right. I mean, so again, but there again, JLR must have then done a risk assessment and thought that our brand, you know, is therefore going to be compromised by Harry and Meghan by association, whether or not that's right, and they have made that decision.
And
money talks.
And we're not the only ones. We're joining the queue of others who've done this. It's just that to do it on the Invictus Games is really kind of not good, and to have Boeing come in just makes it hilarious. Well, makes it very sad and tragic, but also ridiculous.
And just talking to your friends and family in the States, for example, how is the Invictus Games perceived? How are Harry and Meghan perceived?
Two different questions. I don't think they know very much about the Invictus Games. We don't know very much here about what's going on in the States, frankly. I mean, when I speak to my hosts and producers on the shows I'm on in the States, I mean, they barely know who Rishi Sunak is. And
that's very American.
Yeah, and vice versa. We don't really know what's going on there. So I don't think Invictus Games is a big subject. I think Harry and Meghan, their star has fallen considerably. From the time I did some programs when the book came out, Spare, to now, I think they've become a lot less popular.
And obviously certain brands dropping them. I think Spotify, they dropped them, didn't they?
Yeah.
And so therefore, it just depends. I mean, in terms of Netflix, that's still a pretty good gig if they can get those projects away. But you're right, and television is ruthless.
I mean, Harry's not doing himself any favors. Neither of them are. in both countries, and I think it's very sad.
I do too. We'll talk more about this later on with Rupert Bell, actually. Also, I want to know, where is Meghan? Because of course there was that paragraph, wasn't there, on the website that said she was going to be there and she was going to do certain things, and that's now mysteriously been deleted. We'll talk to Rupert about that. Let's move on to your next story then. What else have you got?
Well, there's been this very tragic, as reported in the Mirror and all the papers, earthquake in Morocco, apparently on a fault line, and 1,300 people dead so far. It's really tragic, and the photos and the video footage is just heartrending.
And I think it's a really good story to raise, Roger, because what we must remember is, whilst we're arguing over things that here, seem important to us, these people have lost everything. They've lost their homes, and they didn't have much to start with. The humanitarian effort is underway, and will go on for a long time. And I think the death toll, I think it's now up to 2,000, will actually rise, sadly, dramatically.
Just awful.
Morocco is a huge and actually very prosperous country. So they're not all people living in squalor. I mean, it's the cities are quite elegant,
but in the mountains,
but in the
villages.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just tragic, and the question is, I don't think they're set up for emergency aid in the way that a lot of other countries are.
And we can see the images here, just the devastation.
That makes it even tougher.
I mean, absolutely. And of course, we talked about it being impoverished, but of course people go on holiday, don't they, to Marrakesh, for example. And when you read The Sun, I mean, it's incredibly hard to read, and terrified tourists told of their horror about the earthquake. They dived under tables or ran from their hotels to shelter by poolsides. The video footage showed massive cloud of dust surrounding the historic city, a World Heritage Site. 700,000 Brits travel to Morocco every single year. So you've probably been in an earthquake, haven't you, Roger?
I've not been in an earthquake, no.
I have, and it depends what kind of earthquake it is. When I lived in Los Angeles, I was in an earthquake, and it is the weirdest feeling. It was a rolling. I thought I was like walking on jelly.
Really?
And it's terrifying, and then also surreal all at the same time. And all the buildings over there, of course, are earthquake-proof because they have to be. So the buildings are on rollers, for example. They have, certain shatterproof glass, for example, and they're used to it. But if you have a poorer country, they can't afford that infrastructure.
So the last earthquake there was in 1960, and they lost between 12 and 15,000, depending on what you read, people to that earthquake. So there is possibly a long way to go here, sadly.
Yeah, and of course you must never give up hope, must you?
Never.
Because we hear all these wonderful stories of people surviving.
Especially children. Children seem very resilient to being trapped in rubble for days.
I know.
So my heart goes out to them there, and I hope that the numbers remain low.
So do I. Right, shall we move on to The Express and the story in The Express?
Yes. I'm sorry, but I mean, our government, I'm not the only one who's been saying it for a long time. It just so, and especially Rishi, it's sometimes just so out of touch with what's going on in ordinary people, it seems. I mean, he's announced, it's reported in The Express, that Britain, quote, is leading the world in the battle against immigration.
It doesn't feel like it.
How are we doing that, for goodness sake? And that others will follow, in inverted commas, in our solution, which is Rwanda.
So you're talking about Rwanda. This is about him meeting with Giorgia Meloni, isn't it?
Yeah.
And essentially saying that she supports Rishi Sunak in his endeavours. Actually, I think there's something quite important going on here, which is actually fragmentation of the European Union. You're starting to see countries saying, look, we've got a major migration crisis. All these countries are really struggling as a result of it. The EU has a one-size-fits-all policy, which it likes to do for everything. And I think many of these countries are actually saying no.
And Italy too is under siege, let's not forget that.
Yeah.
Italy has its borders where boats are coming in across that whole strait down the
from Lampedusa.
And she's trying to make a stand against it, although, and I had high hopes for Meloni, and I still have high hopes for her, but even she is being squashed now by the machine.
I agree, and it is odd that Rishi Sunak is spinning it like this. We'll talk about this more later. Of course, he's at the G20 again, talking about, I suppose, the Indian trade deal, for example. What's your view on that? Rishi Sunak, if anyone can pull off a trade deal with India, it should be Rishi Sunak.
I think it's great. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you remember, when he became prime minister, they announced that this is the Indian Raj. You know, we used to have Brits controlling India. Now we have an Indian controlling Britain. You know, people had really high hopes for him. But I think what you say about the EU is true, David. I mean, it stopped for a while, but I think it's starting again. For example, not long after Brexit, I was asked by some Polish television stations to come and talk about Polexit, which was the big subject there. You know, Poland to be next, and then you've heard about Frexit and so on. It's
Italexit.
It's brewing again. I mean, they're very dissatisfied.
Poland, of course, are very dissatisfied by immigration as well. So they are very unhappy about the rules that the EU are imposing on them in terms of the number of immigrants they take.
And yesterday we talked about the Horizon project, £18 billion worth.
2.6 billion a year?
Yeah, just about $2 billion in a year. And the question I asked was, why are we giving the EU money when we could actually have the $2 billion, and we then decide which scientists get it, so that we foster British science? And in a global marketplace, if we're talking about dealing with India, do we really want to be back under the sort of auspices of the EU?
Is it as foolish as that, or is it worse, and it's actually
I think it's
a back door into the EU?
Yes.
And the minute Starmer gets in, we'll be back in the... Who knows?
Well, he says we won't.
He said, yeah, well, I mean, he's a politician, you know, so of course he's going to say that. But, I mean, one doesn't know what's happening. The Horizon thing, there seems to be a lot of scientific, solid ground to doing the deal that it benefits us, without it being a backdoor back into the EU. Only time will tell.
So we had Ben Habib on yesterday. I've tweeted it. It's done really well on social media. But Ben was essentially saying the devil is in the detail here. It's actually, we can't unilaterally leave.
Yeah.
This is also about a European defence plan. They're pushing in PESCO into this. There's a lot more beneath the surface. And I've actually read the 58-page document, which I don't think many people have, who then comment on Twitter and say that I'm just one of those argumentative Brexiteers. No, read the detail.
Yeah, it would be nice if we had actually executed Brexit the way it was intended.
Well, it would be more than nice. It would be the right thing to do.
Well, Boris Johnson in the Mail yesterday was saying, well, we have Brexited. We had a full, frank Brexit. No, we didn't.
No, we didn't. No, we didn't.
He would say that, wouldn't he?
Well, he would. He absolutely would. And I think this is just fascinating in terms of where we go and how we align ourselves in this whole Indian thing and Italy. And I just sense that all is not well in the EU.
No, I sense the same. And I sense that if Rishi can come back with that Indian trade deal, he can kind of redeem himself by doing a great deal, I think.
I think it will take more than the Indian trade deal for Rishi to redeem himself. I really do.
Would it turn around the political fortunes if he came back with a massive trade deal?
I think he needs to do more than that. I think people want to see their borders protected. They want to see true sovereignty. I think he's got a long way to go. Then there's a trans argument, all of these things.
He's done so little of the 5 points.
Exactly.
That if he came back with, as you say, a massive deal, I think he'd get some brownie points for
I hope you're right.
Yeah.
I really do.
But also, whoever advising him thought it was a great idea to give 5 points, which are constantly with him at all times. So when he comes to the election, they'll be like, no, you didn't do that, you didn't do that, you didn't do that.
Well, it's because, David, it's because they have no original thought process. Labour had their 5 pledges, so then someone said, oh, well, we best do 5 then. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's like children in the playground.
Yeah, it goes round
and again,
round.
no long-term strategy. This is the thing that most people get really angry about. Why don't we actually have long-term strategy, whether it's about energy or whether it's about schooling or housing or whatever it is, medicine?
Well, I have set out 6 points to save the UK economy. It's on the internet if anybody can't sleep. And yeah, there are so many obvious solutions that you'd think the government would grab, or B, Labour would step up and say, hey, if we were in power, this is what we'd do.
But you see, I don't know what the Labour Party stands for.
No,
do you?
No, you couldn't slip.
Well, I don't know what the Conservatives stand for.
You couldn't slip a heavily taxed cigarette paper between the two parties today.
No, of course you couldn't.
No.
And that's the problem.
Yeah, and people want choice.
And our voting system. That's the other
And
problem.
our voting system.
Okay. If we got rid of first past the post and had proportional voting so that another party could get in, because otherwise it's always, it's a class war, Frank. I mean, if you go back to what it's really all about, it's a class, or as my wife would say, class war. It's a class war.
She says it correctly.
Yeah, she's Welsh. She says it correctly. Yeah. It's a class war between, the haves and the have-nots, or the whatever you want to call them, and it's never going to change, and nobody else has a chance.
And do you have one more story?
I do. I have the worst story of them all.
Oh, great.
Which is the 2 spies arrested in the Commons on the front page of the Sunday Times.
It's
the
an
newspaper right
story.
here in this wonderful building. 2 spies, 2 Chinese sleeper spies, have been located and arrested. The principal one, in his 20s, is a parliamentary researcher, friends with close to many MPs, including, they mentioned Tom Tugendhat and others. These are people on the inside, inner sanctum sanctorum of the Commons.
And
these
this is not
people
the first time this
No, it
has
isn't.
happened.
And so the question is, having been to that building many times, how on earth did they get security clearance? Because it beggars belief, actually, that they can be allowed in there, they can get close to our parliamentarians, they understand the inner workings of our democracy. And a senior Whitehall source claimed this is a major escalation by China. We have never seen anything like this before. I think it's about the severity of this.
With respect, Renee, this hasn't happened before. That's why that chap says this has never happened before. This is the worst. I mean,
well, we had the Labour deputy about 3 years ago. Who was this? Who was the guy who had the Chinese woman who donated 700,000 quid and had access to his office? So he wasn't a researcher. She wasn't a researcher, but she was in there in the Houses of Parliament.
Yeah, she was wandering around. She had a pass. But this guy was working with ministers and working with MPs. He was part of the team, not an observer like she was.
And that's right. And a parliamentary, if you are a researcher, you have access to other parts of that building. You're very much in the inner sanctum. I mean, clearly you're working for members of Parliament.
You go to the various pubs with the spads and you gossip about everything. And I'm not sure that lady had the same access.
It surely raises the question of how many more there are.
That's a great question.
That's a great question.
And also, I think it also raises a much bigger issue about our relationship with China, because you've got James Cleverly saying we want to cozy up with China, but at the same time, China obviously taking a rather different view.
Well, you raise a really frightening point there. If you were the Chinese handler, would you stick one person in on their own? Of course, you'd have a whole team of people and support system in place.
It's frightening. It is frightening indeed. Roger, thank you very much indeed. Very good to see you. That's Roger Gewolb, who is a political commentator and personal finance expert. Right, time for a break.